Without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Maureen McGee-Ballinger, the Chief of Interpretation at Mount Rushmore National Memorial. And she is going to talk to us for just a little while about the women of Mount Rushmore in honor of Women's History Month. So over to you, Maureen.
Good evening, and thank you for inviting me. It's a privilege to be able to address you, and particularly during Women's History Month. And thinking about that, the women that were integral to the development of the survival of Mount Rushmore, I thought you can't really start with the carving era. It has to go back much farther than that. So I was thinking about the native women who would have been there, the tribes who have used that area as a sacred site. And the Lakota have a proverb. They said, it's observed that any great endeavor it's not enough to depend solely upon yourself. So any great endeavor, you can't just depend on yourself. So looking at that Native American philosophy, thinking about what does that mean? The Lakota people in particular said that every female in the world represents Mother Earth. Well, that's a lot. That's a lot to take on. And they did take it on. And the day-to-day life, it's not really documented that well because that's just what you did. This is, as a woman in the Native society, you had your roles and you just followed those roles. But their society did begin to change as Europeans were coming in, moving across the country. And they had a word that some of you might be familiar with. Has anybody ever heard the word wasichu? Wasichu, when they were using it originally, meant there is so many you can't count. And the wasichu were the bison. So they would look over the edge and they would see all these bison and they would say, "This wasichu." But that changed to mean white. So wasichu now in the Lakota culture, it doesn't mean bison. It means the people who came across. So as they came across, pulling into the Black Hills, the first great draw was that idea of gold. There's gold in the hills. The Black Hills had been set aside as sacred land for the Lakota. There was a treaty. But despite that treaty, the Custer expedition was created. This General Custer, he was charged was to go into the Black Hills, and supposedly, if there was anybody there that was non-native, they were supposed to be out of there. But Custer, with his 7th Cavalry, the summer of 1874, he brought 1,200 men, a 16-piece band, and one woman. This woman was the first non-native woman to come into the Black Hills. And her name was Sarah Campbell. Sarah worked as a cook for as many men as were willing to pay. Sarah was African American. She had been born enslaved, and by the time she was 12 years old, was supposed to be given her freedom, but was not. She was sold to a gentleman who then hired her onto a steamboat as a cook. And at 12 years of age, on that steamboat going up and down the Missouri, Sarah said, "Hey, I am in free people territory. You cannot keep me enslaved." She met a lawyer on that boat. The lawyer sued for her and won her freedom. As she joined the Custer expedition, when they get into the Black Hills, Sarah actually puts in a gold claim. She is the first woman in the Black Hills to have a gold claim on French Creek. So this incredible woman is followed by other incredible women. The next one, Annie Talent. Annie Talent was considered the first white woman to come into the Black Hills. And she came in just the following fall after Sarah. And she was coming in with a group. They were also looking for gold. And to get to the Black Hills, Annie had to walk for 78 days in the fall in the Black Hills. So if you've spent much time in the fall in the Black Hills, imagine 78 days on foot. And her shoes were so bad that she wrapped gunny sacks around her feet to be able to make it. Well, of course, she wasn't supposed to be there. She was the only female in their group, but their whole group wasn't supposed to be there. That was supposed to be land that was set aside. Nonetheless, people kept coming in. It didn't stop them that first group was kicked out. So as more people came in, the Black Hills start to grow up, Deadwood's growing up as a wild community. And you get further into what is happening in the Black Hills. But along with Deadwood, you start getting miners and lawyers and all of the other folks coming in. And Doan Robinson, he's a state historian. He wants to bring more people in. And he hires Gutzon Borglum to carve this amazing idea of his statues in what would be Custer State Park. Over the course of his carving era, carving Mount Rushmore, 400 men. A lot of us have heard about those 400 men, various names, some more familiar than others. But what we don't hear so much about are the 16 women that were involved in that entire process. One of the first, well, Kay talked about the Mount Rushmore Society and their 90-year heritage. Well, the commission, the Mount Rushmore National Memorial Commission, hired Lorraine Spuntz as one of the 12 commissioners. She was the only commissioner on that first Mount Rushmore Society, well, it would become the Mount Rushmore Society Commission. She was selected by President Coolidge, and she served from 1929 to 1939. She was the second member on the team that was from Texas. She had been a friend of Gutzon Borglum's, and in Texas, she had been the head of the Corpus Christi Chamber of Commerce. She worked tirelessly to bring funding for the sculpture. She was bringing federal funding, and she was working in local funding. And she wasn't the only woman out there. You had women working in the bunkhouse, the place where the men would stay overnight. Some of the men would board, or they would stop there to eat. They had a restaurant. People working in the board house or the restaurant were wives or were connected somehow to some of the workers. A woman like Sylvia Berg. Sylvia worked in the boarding house at Mount Rushmore from 1936 to 1941. She was the waitress and the cook, and she was the wife of a coalman, a driller, Raymond Berg. The women behind the men who were working there, some right on site, some a little further away, they were providing that support that enabled these people to be working on the sculpture. They were the ones who were providing from home emotional support, spiritual support. People like Mary Sarasani. Arthur Sarasani was one of the artists that came from the East. He had worked with Gutzon Borglum in the East. Married to Mary, when he was at Mount Rushmore, she was constantly sending him letters of support, letters of energy, keep him going, keep him positive. And eventually, she actually came out and joined him. She joined him for about a month to really encourage him to keep going. And what does Mary do when she gets there? Well, Mary actually becomes a tour guide. She starts leading people to the top of Mount Rushmore. She's taken them up 800 steps to get to the top to see what these guys are working on. And what did she get for that? 25 cents a person. 800 steps, 25 cents a person, and there were days she went up 4 times in a day. Mary Sarasani supporting her husband, Arthur. Gladys Swenson. Gladys worked in the bunkhouse, and she was married to Charles Halstead. And when you're thinking about the bunkhouse, you also have the restaurant there. That means anybody like Gladys or Sylvia, they were also serving the public. In this time period, you had visitors coming into Mount Rushmore, tourists, and they could eat right at that bunkhouse, right where they were cooking for the men. They would serve you a meal for 35 cents. So these were our kind of our first concessionaires at Mount Rushmore were the women. And if you've got a restaurant and you have tour guides, well, there was an information center. The information center was the studio. The first sculptor studio and the second sculptor studio were information centers. And Mary Reed Wilcox was basically hired by Borglum to run the information center, to operate that studio. Along with her, Carol Payne, married to another worker. So Carol was in there, she was providing information. She did some tour guiding. And she was hired by Borglum when she was 16 years old. So she would, after high school, she would go and work in the information center and give tours. When she graduated, she continued to work for Borglum, continuing to help at information center. Tour guides, information centers, restaurants, bunkhouses, these are all things that sometimes are overlooked as background things. But what are we doing today? We have all of those things going on today. These were all started and supported by the women at Mount Rushmore. Right down to the secretary for Boland, Miriam Hicks. From 1938 to 1941, she took care of all of Boland's paperwork. She kept him straight. Maybe Gutson wouldn't have liked that, but that's what she was doing, is keeping them going. And today, yes, we have our secretaries as well. We have our administrative people as well. And today, when we're looking at the women, Mount Rushmore, well, goodness, just look at that boardroom right there. You have Diana, you have Kay, you have Stephanie. We have had a first female superintendent, Cheryl Schreier, served 10 years at Mount Rushmore. And what did we just find out? Our next superintendent, also a female superintendent, to continue to run Mount Rushmore. The women have really made Mount Rushmore work. They're not background people. They're not the extra people. They're the folks that keep everything going. The people who are of the earth. The people who are contributing in the background, but we should be thinking about putting them in the foreground. So next time you're thinking about women at Mount Rushmore, don't just save it for March. Think about it all year.
Thank you. Thank you, Maureen. That's awesome. Yay. In sign language, this is clapping, so I'm clapping for you.
Thank you very much. You know, it's always illuminating to hear the histories of folks such as Sarah Campbell and a life story. So I'm just wondering, where do you mine this information from? Because it's so easy for these tales to be forgotten, you know, through history and historians, but it's very important because you know, that's real trailblazing there.
Well, everywhere. I look everywhere. The Sarah Campbell story has fascinated me for several years, and so I've dug deeper into her story. She had a silver mine. She died in Galena. She's buried in Galena. She's pretty incredible woman. There was a program from the South Dakota State Historical Society collecting pioneer stories. And that was where I first heard it, was reading some of those books. But I met several of these women that way.
Fascinating. Thank you.